Is there a message of necessity at the desk? There is a message of necessity at the desk. Move to accept the message of necessity. The message is accepted.
Okay, welcome back to another episode of Messages of Necessity. I'm Tim Hoefer, and I'm joined today by Empire Center's Adjunct Fellow, Roberta Schaefer. Roberta, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, your story is really interesting. In fact, I was thinking as I was preparing for this interview that you're doing it the wrong way. Most people are moving out of New York, and you moved into New York.
Yes, in a certain sense, much to our chagrin, we had no idea how much more expensive New York is than Massachusetts, even Massachusetts, which used to
is
be
saying
known,
something.
Which used to be known, as we probably remember, Taxachusetts. But I think that New York does take the cake. So anyway, we moved here. We have 2 daughters and 6 grandchildren, and we moved to one is a mile away, and the other is in New Jersey, and so we chose to buy a condo in a very nice area in Westchester, and I. Neither my husband nor I was actually ready to retire. So I immediately got in touch with the Empire Center, which I knew about from my work in Massachusetts. I was the founding director of the Worcester Regional Research Bureau, which is a similar kind of organization as the Empire Center. And we focused primarily on local and regional issues in central Massachusetts. There is an equivalent organization to ours in Boston, the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, and we were modeled after them. So that our organization, the one in Worcester, goes back to 1985. And I did that for 30 years, writing and researching and so on. And I am trying to continue doing that here. It's my first love.
Well, you were doing great work there, and now you're doing great work for us. So we're
thank you.
Excited.
So while I was in Massachusetts, by the way, I'm a native of New York. I was born and bred in Brooklyn, and I went through the New York City public schools at a time when they were considered the best in the nation. In any case, while I was in Massachusetts, I was appointed to the State Board of Education, and I served on that board for 11 years, from 1995 to 2006. It was during a time that Massachusetts was going through its major education reform, and I came on the board shortly after the Education Reform Act of 1993 was passed in Massachusetts, commonly known as MIRA, Massachusetts Education Reform Act. And that was an incredible experience, actually helping to design. The board was responsible for implementing this act. And it was a top to bottom total reform of the entire public education system.
So we're going to get into that. That's really interesting, and I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But let's start by talking about the report that you just did earlier this month, released. Title of it is "Better Results with Lower Spending." Sold. I'm in. Let's do it. Right. But it's a comparison of education systems in New York and Massachusetts. And before we get into the nitty gritty, just give us a quick explanation of why New York and Massachusetts is a good comparison, because we could have chosen anywhere, right? Massachusetts, it does really well on national rankings, and so the results are good. But there's demographic reasons why it's a good choice. How come?
Okay, so they're neighboring states. Obviously, they actually touch one another. And they're both, in a certain respect, older industrial states. Yep. Many parts of it had big industries which have left the scene. They're both states that a lot of immigrants come to. Good jumping off points for people, but many people also, remain. So there's a good size population of English language learners. In fact, there are a greater percentage in Massachusetts than in New York. While the cost of living is slightly lower in Massachusetts, they're both relatively high cost states in terms of property taxes and the industrial property that's been left. The school systems are very different in size. Massachusetts as a whole has a little under 1 million students, which is about what New York City has. So it's, different in that respect, but we also have the big cities, which spend a lot more on education. Boston and New York City and so on spend a lot more on education than smaller places. It's got the wealthy suburbs.
So demographically, population-wise, regionally, location, those are all very similar. So it's a pretty good comparison.
Also, and like earlier, the unions, they're heavily unionized, both states, unionized,
right?
Which is really important.
So I just wanted to set the scene for why we made that choice, and then so we could jump in now a little bit into your findings. Regular listeners here, and really anybody who pays attention, already know that New York is a high spending state on education. We're well above the national average. It's 36% more here than it is in Massachusetts on a per pupil basis. So New York is spending lots and lots of money, and that sort of evolved over decades, but really since the early 2000s, when some court decisions and legislative action changed the way that we do funding for schools, and we wanted to equalize it and make it fair. And so the spending has sort of gone up exponentially over a relatively short period of time. Massachusetts, it's been a totally different ride. But the outcome outside of spending is that, like we said before, Massachusetts performs really, really well in the national rankings, and New York at best is somewhere in the middle, low middle, right? So we've sort of, by practice, debunked this throw money at the problem and it'll get better. That hasn't worked. So what did you find when you started doing these comparisons?
Okay, so I think most people go back to, when they're talking about the education reform movement, go back to the famous 1983 report, A Nation at Risk, where this commission that was put together by President Reagan found that the schools were not asking enough of their students, and that we were a nation at risk. And it was time to start raising standards and holding people accountable for the money that they were getting. Now, until that time, really, the federal government was not very involved in education in the states. So this was, kind of like a mandate, not a mandate, but, states better get going. And at the same time, many states were being sued on exactly the grounds that you were just talking about, about unequal resources to the districts within a state. And both Massachusetts and New York were in that situation. So Massachusetts, the court order came down in about 1990. And that's when they had to redo the formula. In New York, it wasn't until about 2005 that order came down. And so the reform movement, such as it was in New York, there wasn't legislation until 2007, I believe. So Massachusetts did have a head start on this, but what happened at the time was there was an agreement, bipartisan. Massachusetts tends to elect at times liberal Republican governors. Otherwise, it's a solidly blue state. The legislature, like the one in New York, is wholly Democratic. In the Senate, at this point, there are either 4 or 6 out of 40 senators who are Republicans. So in that respect, it's very, similar to what happens in what goes on in New York. So, but there was this bipartisan agreement. Governor William Weld was elected in 92. And the legislature you probably remember the name Bolger. Well, William Bolger was the president of the Senate. His brother is another story. That was the notorious, I have it right, the notorious one who was, ultimately convicted and so on. And in the House, they had the head of the Education Committee was Mark Roosevelt, who was a great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. So you had this confluence of these 3 people got together and said, okay, we really have to do something here. And they came up with a plan, the Massachusetts Education Reform Act of 1993, which was passed overwhelmingly by the legislature and signed by the governor. And it was called a grand bargain. We're going to give the districts money based on what they can afford, using the usual population and income level and, distribute with the kind of property that the community had. And we'll figure out a foundation formula. And each district will get that formula, will get that amount of money. Now, if they can't afford it themselves, the difference would be made up by the state. So everybody was put on a more or less equal footing. Not that they each got the same amount of money, but it was based on the characteristics of the community. And in exchange for giving them that money, we're going to do a top to bottom reform, starting with high standards. We're going to write a set of high standards. Then we're going to write curriculum frameworks that spell it out, that are linked to the standards. And then we're going to have test for students, MCAS, the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System. And then on top of that, we're going to change teacher qualifications, what it takes to become a teacher, with a very difficult test called MTEL. And we're going to require professional development. And all of this is going to be tied to the standards and the curriculum frameworks. So professional development was going to be tied to that. So the whole system was linked together.
So really it was, you're talking about a top to bottom reform of the education system where they touched everything, and it was standards forward.
Yep.
Everything else to follow and support that.
Right, exactly.
And the results tell us that it was successful.
It was, absolutely. And what they did was they didn't load it all, front end it with everything at once, the way I'll come to what New York did. They said, okay, we're going to start implementing this stuff, but there will be no tests that count until everything is rolled out and we have some sample tests. We do that for a couple of years. So it was a methodical process, not a terribly long time, but for politics, a long time. And they asked the people to be patient, let's persevere, because on the first teacher test, 41% passed. So by a few years later, it was 62%.
Meaning it was hard to get certified to be a teacher.
Yes, harder. And because they
which every parent should appreciate and like. It's hard to be a teacher.
They were looking to, along with upgrading curriculum, the teachers would have to be prepared to be able to teach that. So they went into the ed schools and said, this is what we would like you to teach. And it's got to be tied to the Massachusetts standards. And some of them did it, some of them didn't. And that's an ongoing issue about the education schools. A lot has been written about this. They're still nowhere near they should be. And this is the National Council on Teacher Quality has done a tremendous amount of work looking at these ed schools across the country. They've got some great reports out. And they have found that the ed schools are not offering the kinds of courses or not encouraging the students to take the kinds of courses that they need to be able to teach what is required. This is especially true in the elementary schools, where the teachers are being asked to teach a whole variety of subjects, and they're not prepared to do it if they haven't had that kind of training or professional development then for those who are already in the system.
So maybe there's a little resistance, and of course, change, regardless, as in relative terms, this is kind of a new thing in Massachusetts, right, over the history of public education, and that's to be expected, but largely it's working.
Well, yeah.
So I want to turn to New York, because this is your paper is a study of contrast and compare.
Right.
So what's the contrast?
So in New York, in 2007, when they started looking at this, that was when Governor Spitzer was still in office, and he was asking the legislature to tie accountability measures to the increase in funding for the districts. The legislature never approved that. So again, you're giving them money, inputs, and you're not demanding a change in performance. Right. And there weren't the consequences. What they did was they immediately identified underperforming districts. In Massachusetts, they waited until the whole thing was rolled out and everybody was doing this before saying, okay, these districts aren't performing well and we have to hold them accountable.
So let the new standards be set, let them be implemented, then measure it rather than
right. So that everybody was sort of on an even starting point in Massachusetts. So in New York, they immediately said, okay, 56 districts are underperforming, and the state told them you have to do one of four things. One was reduce class size, and New York already has one of the lowest per pupil student ratios in the entire country. It's under 12. Massachusetts is slightly over 12 to 1. Okay. So, they said you have to restructure the high school or the middle school. They gave them things that they had to do, and they threw the money at them immediately and said, do it. Well, if these schools are already underperforming, they got to figure out where the weaknesses are before they can absorb any of the money in an intelligent way. And New York did not give them that opportunity. Just pick one of these things that we're saying you should do and just do it. Right. So naturally, and in fact, one of your people at Empire found that then it was just a giveaway. It was a grant that was given to the district, and no accountability for what you're doing with the money for the results.
Yeah, it was sort of like action for action's sake and results be date.
Right.
Like, what's it matter? Right.
And it does take a lot to be able to say, be patient. This is going to take maybe a decade to see results. Well, people get elected every 2 years, every 4 years, whatever, and they want to see results right away. And then they wonder, why this thing has failed and we just threw more money at it and it didn't work.
So a big difference you're saying is it's in the implementation of the reforms, and the extension of that here is you prove that by measurements, but the measurements have been a moving target in New York. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So it seems to be changing every few years. New York has long had the Regents exams. Those were the requirements for graduation. Then they sort of backed off that and said, well, we'll change the Regents. So it used to be that the Regents exams were for those who were going on to higher education. Then they said, no, everybody has to pass the Regents. So naturally you have to, lower the standards on the Regents to get everybody to pass. And now they're on to a new thing, which is going in the exact opposite direction. I mean, the people who are well respected in the education field have said for a long time, you need to start with high standards, content-rich standards. We need to teach people substance, the material of math, sciences, English, history, and so on, so that they get a knowledge base, which is something that serves you for the rest of your life. I mean, sometimes, you people today, they'll use, idiomatic expressions, which I'm sorry, in my day, everybody knew what that meant. And now they don't know, cultural references that were common, all kinds of things that make us one people. Instead, the focus is on that, that we all had a common base of knowledge. And that's what public education was supposed to do.
So there's a handful of these are practical things that have been implemented. You talked some about the Massachusetts and some from New York, and they're, shameless plug. If listeners want to know more, go read the paper. You can find it on our website, empirecenter.org. But the other side of the scale on this is thinking about how these policy decisions are made. So the structure of the education systems in the two states are very different.
Yes.
Can you just talk a little bit about that?
This was the first thing that I found, which was so striking because, to be honest, I had never thought about it. How education policy is made in the states. So in Massachusetts, there's a state board of education that is appointed by the governor. You don't even have to have legislative approval for the nominees. Now, there are certain restrictions. They have to have a business person on the board, a union member on the board, a parent on the board, a student on the board. So of the 11, at least 4 are fixed. And not that the person is fixed, but the kind of person that you have on the board. And then, of course, you have to have, you should have geographic representation, which is how I got there, because Central Mass was not on the board. I mean, the bulk of people are living in the Boston metro area. Okay. So they're accountable to the governor. And the policy starts with the governor. And obviously with the ed reform, it had to be, in conjunction with the legislature. You always have to have that because they have to agree to it if it's going to be legislated. Okay. In New York, now the Regents is the oldest body of doing education policy in the entire country. Predates the Constitution, goes back to 1784. Excuse me. It has evolved over the years, but the way the Board of Regents is chosen is by a concurrent resolution of both houses of the legislature. The governor has no role in choosing any of the members of the Board of Regents. So that means that there's not one person, but there are a few hundred to whom you say they're accountable.
And that's a significant difference. And it creates, whether it's an incentive issue or accountability issue, like you're saying, it really flips the model around
completely. So
because of that, not one answering person.
So they choose people on the basis of one from each judicial district. Honestly, I never even heard of a judicial district until I moved back here. And so there are.
But there's an obvious correlation, right? I guess.
Yeah. But okay. So you have, I think it's 14 judicial districts, and then there are some at large, a few at large, for 3 or 4. But those two are chosen not by the governor, but chosen again by the legislature. So you can imagine in each district, the legislators get together and, who's their favorite person and so on and so forth. And there's no, there's no, feedback to the legislature. And, in the long run, yeah, sure, because the legislature has to provide the money. But you can't imagine that a couple of hundred people are going to get together and say, well, did this program work or did that? So the regents is very powerful, because they don't have that kind of accountability. Below them, they have a Department of Education that's supposed to do the implementation. But the regents, they appointed this Blue Ribbon Commission to look at what should be the requirements for graduation from high school. And they come up with something which is entirely the opposite direction of the success in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
But entirely. Forget standards, forget, this is going to be, it's based on what is called, and I hope I can get this straight, the culturally responsive, sustainable education framework. Now, if you can define that for me, please go ahead and do. But
I don't want to put a too fine a point on this, but before we get past it too far, the accountability piece of this is really important, right? The legislators are elected, of course, but they're elected by a portion of the population. The governor, and the reason that we have a system that elevates a person to be in charge is exactly for that, to have that accountability. So when you've taken the accountability away from a person and you've given it to a large body, like you said, that distributes the accountability over hundreds of legislative seats, then nobody is responsible when things don't go well and things aren't going well. And that's, so that's a direct cause. Is that the biggest governance disparity that you see between the two states?
Yes, because and the reason that I said this is really an outlier, only North Carolina has a similar system where the legislature chooses, but even there, the chief executive officer for education is elected by the people.
So that person is the accountable person. If you're not happy with education, you don't vote for that person again, right? That you can sort of aim in and fire.
And in 33 of our states, the system is similar to the one in Massachusetts. Most of them do have legislative approval of the governor's appointees, like in the Senate for, approving a cabinet position. But New York is a total outlier in this respect, with the power of the regents. And what was interesting to me is most people have heard of the New York State region. Anybody who knows, is involved in public policy has heard of the New York State regents. Oh, and this is supposed to be, this blue ribbon body going back to the days when, when I was in the system. As I said, New York City was regarded as probably the best public school system in the nation. And, there are lots of reasons for that, things have changed and so on. But to have this now without anybody saying, gee, why is it that Massachusetts is scoring 1 or 2 on NAEP, the National Assessment for Education Progress, the nation's report card, so to speak, and New York is 32. It's below the national average.
Well, and this is where we started. It's not a resource problem. We talked about money already.
How but no one has thought to say, gee, where does this all start? How could this be that this is the situation we're in? And so And I have to say that the changes that are being proposed are going to be considered by the regents in November, and they're supposed to hold hearings on these proposed changes in this fall. And parents need to, and people in authority need to understand what these changes are going to do to public education in New York. It's not going to raise performance.
That's a good segue to what will be our last little section here is, so there are changes. The legislature also authorized a study on how foundation aid formula is built, and that's happening sort of right now. So those things are all happening in parallel. It seems like there's going to be a call for changes to the system. You have some ideas on that, right? This research led to some proposals in your paper about what New York could do. So if you pick three, what are the three big things the state could do to begin to right the ship on education?
Well, I don't know how you can get a group together to push for changing the governing structure. The governor has to be involved. The education is one of the biggest functions of state government.
It's also one of the biggest spending areas of state government.
Yes. Yeah. Only to be probably only surpassed by Medicaid and
healthcare
that stuff.
Right.
Okay.
So number one is change the governmental structure, provide accountability through the governor or some other function.
And the first problem you encounter is that since it's the legislature that has the authority over that, who is going to vote to change the structure? I mean, somebody said, "Oh, this has been in existence since 1784." What are you talking about? We've had this all along. Tradition, and so. This is a major issue, but I hope that Empire will somehow move forward in pushing for this kind of very serious change, which, it's like part of, changing a charter, something that's been in existence for several hundred years now. And at least, the way it's chosen. It has to, the governor has to be involved in this. And then they need to think in terms of how to revamp the system in a way that will produce better results. And instead, they're moving in this direction of saying the purpose of public education is equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they're not talking about substantive, content-rich curriculum. They're talking instead, it actually says in these proposals we're going to have students study power structures, and we're going to have them, elevate formerly marginalized groups, all the language that we've been hearing now. Only every day you read about another college or another big business like Amazon or Beta eliminating the DEI staffs.
Well, and it's almost beside the point, regardless of how you think about or feel about DEI implementation. The real point I think you're making is that the educational standards and curriculum have suffered at the inclusion of those things, right? And so whether or not they're included as part of the conversation and whether or not the Department of Education wants to move in that direction, they shouldn't do it at the exclusion of paying attention to results and curriculum and what we're actually teaching children and how we're preparing them for the rest of their lives. So, okay, so I asked you for three, you gave me two, but they're gigantic. So let's stop there. There is a lot more in the report. It's a great report. I really enjoyed reading it, and I don't always say that about our reports. This was a good one. So thank you, Roberta, for jumping on with us. Thank you for doing this work. I know you've got a couple things in the pipeline coming out, so listeners, get ready. We're just getting started down this path. All right, that's it for another episode of Messages and Necessities. Thank you, Roberta. Thank you, listeners, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thanks a lot for having me.
For more news and analysis, visit our website and sign up for email updates at empirecenter.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Empire Center.